Hello friends, welcome to UPSC Logics, and in this video we shall have a look at the Indian Councils Act 1892. So this is the next act that came into existence after the Councils Act of 1861, and a lot of water had flown under the bridge since 1861. The Indian National Congress had been formed. So this particular act came into existence with keeping in mind what the Indians wanted, what the educated Indians wanted, and so let us have a look at what the Indian Councils Act 1892 had to offer. The Indian Councils Act 1892 was passed by the British Parliament to increase the size of the legislative councils, and it also marked the beginning of the representative form of government in India. After 1861, the next act which came into existence was the Councils Act of 1892. A lot of changes had come into India, and Indians had become extremely aware of their rights, and there was a certain growth in nationalism. In fact, a lot of organizations had been formed that had been working towards the betterment of the Indian community. Indians had become educated, and people like Dada Bhai Naroji had actually impounded the theory of the economic drain of India. So people were becoming aware slowly what the British had been doing in India and how their wealth was being drained out of India. In fact, the Indian National Congress that had been formed had started to make some resolutions in their sessions like that of 1885 and 1889, where they had started making moderate demands on the British for the betterment of India. In fact, some of the major demands that were placed before the British were that a simultaneous examination of ICS should be held in England and India. There should be reforms of the Legislative Council, and the principle of election in place of nomination should be adopted by the British. The simple reason given for this particular demand was that it was it was the people whose representation is to be made in the legislative councils, and therefore it was imperative to let the people elect whom they wanted to send into these councils rather than the British nominating the representation of India. Then there was a opposition in the annexation of Upper Burma, and the reduction in military expenditure was asked for. The reason for the second demand mentioned above was that the Indians were dissatisfied over the existing system of governance. So the Indian leaders wanted admission to a considerable number of elected members, and they also wanted a right to discuss the budget matters. Till now, the Indians had been working with the British, and it was the moderates who were making such kind of demands. And these demands could easily be satisfied by the British. So Lord Dufferin set up a committee, and this committee was given the responsibility to set a plan for the enlargement of provincial councils and enhancement of their status. This particular report that was drawn by this committee was sent to the Secretary of State of India. However, it did not like the or agree to the principle of direct elections. And however, the principle of representation by way of indirect elections was accepted with some limitations. So this is what came out in the Indian Councils Act 1892, where the idea of indirect elections was adopted, and the British had in fact bent down to the Indian demand to a certain limit. So let us have a look at the features of this particular act, and definitely it increased the number of members on the recommendations or the demands of the moderates, and they increased the number of members in the central and provincial legislative councils. However, they maintained a majority in them. Then it increased the functions of the legislative councils and gave them the powers to discuss the financial bills and asking questions to the executive after giving a 6-day notice period to the government. And although the elections were not admitted through this particular act, but it did give certain provisions for the nominations of the non-official members. Like for example, the Members of the Central Legislative Councils to the Viceroy could be done on the recommendation of the Provincial Legislative Councils in the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, and then the members of the Provincial Legislative Councils could have been appointed by the governors on the recommendation of district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, jamidars, and various other chambers of commerce which were localized. So let us have a look at the term elections in relations to the Indian Councils Act 1892, and this particular act introduced several new rules and regulations. Number one was that there was a significant feature of this Indian Councils Act that the procedure of election was introduced through this. However, the word election was very carefully avoided in it. The Act envisaged that apart from the elected official members, there would be elected non-official members whose number was to be 5. The non-official members of the council were one to be elected by each of the non-official member of the 4 provincial legislatures of Bombay, Madras, Calcutta and Northwestern Province, and one from the Calcutta Chamber of Commerce. The Governor General nominated the other 5 non-officials himself. In case of provincial legislatures, the body is permitted to elect the members of municipalities, district boards, universities and Chamber of Commerce. The method of election, however, was not mentioned in clear terms. The elected members were officially declared as nominated, although after taking into consideration the recommendations of each body. The legislative bodies met in several sessions in order to prepare recommendations to the governor and the head of the provincial government, which was the viceroy. The person favored by the majority was not described as elected, rather they were directly recommended for nominations. So friends, if you can understand what is written over here, it was a simple process that although the government was calling it elections, but they were not elections in the real sense. For example, all the members were recommended by certain bodies, and these recommendations were made through those bodies when certain people who were supposed to go to the or become the members of the central or legislative provinces, they were selected through a method of election. Like people voted, okay, we'll nominate this person or the other person, but and then all these recommended or nominated people, you can call them, or the recommendations would go to the viceroy or general governor general, and he would select from them. So in a way, these particular people were elected, and they were not elected as well, they were nominated. So I hope you have understood this particular point. In case there is any doubt, do write in the comment section. Now let us have a look at the analysis of the Councils Act of 1892. This was undoubtedly an advancement on the Act of 1861, and it widened the functions of the legislature. A lot of power was given to the members of the different legislatures, and they could obtain information and ask questions from the executive. Then of course the Councils Act of 1892 made it essential for the financial accounts for the last year and the budget for the next year to be presented in front of the legislature, and the members were allowed to make observations on the budget and make suggestions on increase of revenue and expenditure. The most significant part of this particular act was the introduction of the principle of election. Now, this is of a constitutional significance since this was the first time that this method was being adopted. However, it wasn't elections in the real sense, and this was one of the major shortcomings of this particular act, because of which it had failed to satisfy the Indian nationalists. The act was criticized at successive sessions of the Congress, and the critics of this particular act said that the election procedure was a roundabout one. In fact, it was only a theoretical process and not in the real sense, because the members who were recommending the particular members were not elected and they were also nominated members. Moreover, the functions of the legislative councils were also strictly circumscribed. So, in conclusion, we can say that the Indian Councils Act 1892 fell short on the demands made by the National Congress. However, it was a great advance in the existing state of things where power to ask questions, power to make recommendations on the budget, etc., were given to the members of the legislative and central and provincial legislatives. So, friends, this brings us to the end of the Indian Councils Act 1892, and I hope you have enjoyed this particular video and understood what the Councils Act 1892 was all about. Thank you so much for watching and have a nice day. Jai Hind.